Hi, welcome to the Aerospace Maker channel. I'm Aaron Harper. This channel is all about the nuts and bolts of aerospace. This week is the transmit section of the link budget in preparation for satellite reception projects. At the end of these videos, we will have made a satellite ground station receiver and received images from space. This week we'll cover the satellite communication from the transmitter to the antenna aboard the spacecraft. First, a little bit of history. We need to make it clear that what we're doing is not really new or novel. It is only the ease at which we are doing this and the low cost that is new. Back in the mid-'80s, some rather smart folks figured out how to do all this on a home computer. These computers included the TRS-80 color computer, or COCO, and the Atari ST. And they used it to decode the retransmitted NOAA signals used in the WeFax service. Here's an example of the Atari ST system output. You can see it's black and white. There's really no grayscale, maybe just a little bit of dithering. But the other program was the WeFax program used on the TRS-80 color computer, or COCO. Here is the code in the basic programming language that was used to accomplish this. Note that while it's written in BASIC, there is an assembly language component to it. That's what all the gobbledygook right here is. Basically, it's not that complex. This is because all the signal processing was handled by terrestrial NOAA resources, and the radio reception was handled by a scanner or a ham radio rig that was specifically used for this process. Where our effort will differ is that we will be receiving the signal directly from the satellite, processing the signal and decoding it on our own PC. On to the rest of our discussion. Every part of the path the signal takes changes the signal in both intentional and unintentional ways. To move the signal through space, we would modulate a radio signal and then amplify it. Inadvertently, a small amount of noise or other distortion is always added. While this noise is minimal at this point compared to the signal, it is something to bear in mind in the event of a malfunction, as well as when we go further down into the link budget segments where the signal is much smaller. A basic transmitting system can be summarized in the following diagram. The modulator is a component which puts the information onto a radio signal. It determines the type of encoding, the modulation method, and the frequency of the system. The amplifier takes the small signal produced by the modulator and then boosts it, so it determines the signal level that is put out to the antenna. Usually the modulator and amplifier are lumped together and called the transmitter. The filter is generally used to prevent unintended signals produced by the modulator and amplifier from being transmitted by the antenna or degrading the intended signal in some way. There are some losses associated with this component, the filter, but they're generally quite low. Another source of fairly low-level losses are the transmission line and the connectors. Each of these is fairly low, but in a large system, they do add up. The antenna is the final component in the transmit segment, and it determines the pattern and polarization of the signal. The pattern is the way in which the signal makes its way to Earth. All right, rather than spread the pattern equally in all directions, almost like if you can imagine an apple on a stick, and by the way, that's called an omnidirectional pattern, the signal is brought in and focused more in a conical pattern so that the useful signal goes towards the Earth. The fact that we're moving more of the signal towards the intended target is how gain is created. And that's determined primarily by the pattern. Now, the polarization of the signal, which is also determined by the antenna, It determines what orientation the electromagnetic field of our signal ends up with. For terrestrial applications, like we would be familiar with TV antennas, most signals are either vertically or horizontally polarized. Such an example would be, for example, rabbit ears on a TV, or if you look at the TV antennas that are up on people's roofs in areas, especially rural areas, there are these flat monstrosities that attempt to pick up a signal that is horizontally or vertically polarized. Now, unfortunately, in space, the satellite is not always in the same spot or orientation relative to us. For example, if a satellite is coming up over the horizon, it's pointing this way, but we might be pointing some other direction. So it's really hard to say that the concepts of vertical or horizontal or up or down actually apply in space. In fact, they become pretty much meaningless. Now, a different type of polarization is used in space. This signal is polarized in a circular format. Think of it as a corkscrew. As the circular polarized signal comes in, it corkscrews in, and the whole issue of what is up and down really doesn't matter. The only thing that does is the way in which the twist goes. The right hand circular polarization or left hand circular polarization, because that determines how the antenna is constructed. Now, note that it takes a left-hand circular polarized antenna for a right-hand circular polarized antenna on the ground to receive the signal with 100% connection. Because if they go the same direction, the signals cross. They don't actually interact. So that when you have a left-hand and a right-hand circular polarization, they actually mesh up and they follow the path for the signal. Now, what happens if we use the wrong antenna? It's called a polarization mismatch. But oddly enough, not much happens with a circular polarization mismatch. If you use a left-hand circular polarized antenna and a right-hand circular polarized antenna, you have 100% match, and theoretically you have 100% of your signal being coupled. If it is mismatched, or for example, if you use a vertical polarization antenna on a circular polarized signal, you won't get all of your signal there. The signal will be diminished, of course. But in contrast to a mismatch of a horizontal and a vertical polarization, where your signal loss is pretty much absolute, losing half your signal or even 3/4 of your signal is not that big of a deal. There's still a signal there. And that is something that we'll be taking advantage of later. Now, in our situation, in our scenario, the information we need, with a couple of exceptions, may be found on page 50 of the NOAA User's Guide for Building and Operating Environmental Satellite Receiving Stations Handbook. The PDF was linked in last week's video and is also in the comments section below. What we don't have is the antenna gain figures, as well as the line losses, and some assumptions will be made to fill this gap. Here we see the frequency, or frequencies in this case. The one we are interested in is the 137.1. There are some other frequencies in use, but that is the one we're actually interested in. Carrier modulation is another thing we're interested in. It says analog, AM, and FM. The specific signal at 137.1 is an FM signal. The transmit power is 5 watts, and that is something that we really needed to know. Antenna polarization, right-hand circular. And the carrier deviation is plus or minus 17 kilohertz. Now, some of this information is important right now, and others will become important as we start to decode the signal. Now let's work with our assumptions. Given the distance from Earth, it's logical to assume that the pattern will be tightened up in a cone. rather than most of the signal lost in directions where nobody is listening. Most low Earth orbit or LEO antennas are optimized to be around a 5 or 6 dB gain. But the NOAA satellites are actually much higher than LEO. They're in a sun-synchronous orbit, which is roughly 800 to 900 kilometers, not the 400 kilometers we would expect for LEO. That means that because they are more than twice the distance away, their pattern would be tighter and therefore logically have a higher gain. It's reasonable to assume that the antenna gain of plus 9 dB or more is possible, but let's stick with plus 6 dB and just get a pleasant surprise at the end of the day. The next part is that we need to assume that the connector and line losses, because they didn't publish these. Now, if we assume a minus 0.5 dB loss for all the connectors and filters, which is reasonable, and then add the expected loss of 3 meters of the standard cable for that frequency band, which is LMR 400, or its aerospace equivalent, we arrive at 0.05 dB worth of loss. Now, if we add the two together, the connector loss and the connector and filter loss, as well as the cable losses, we arrive at a minus 0.55 dB value of loss between the amplifier on one side and the antenna on the other. So now let's move forward into the calculations. First, we need to calculate the signal level in dBW, or decibels per watt, as it's coming out of the amplifier. Now, converting watts to dBW is a relatively straightforward process with any calculator that can do logarithms. It's basically 10 times log 10 of the power. To simplify things, there is a calculator available on the Wolfram Alpha Tools section of our aerospacemaker.org website, and the link is below. Essentially, 5 watts is positive 7 dBW, which is the value that's coming out of the amplifier section. The line, filter, and connector losses bring this down to 7 minus 0.55, or 6.45 dBW. Now, let's add the antenna gain of plus 6 dB, and we arrive at a figure of plus 12.45 dBW. This is the number that we were after for this section, and it's called the equivalent isotropic radiated power, or EIRP. Well, that's it for this transmit section. Next week, we'll go through the free space propagation segment for NOAA 19. There will be a fair bit of trig involved, so if you're a little weak on the subject, please review the material in the Khan Academy video below. Let's go. Now, we had some questions via email, so I'll go ahead and answer them now. First question is, how are you funded and what are your plans for the future? Actually, that's 2 questions. Right now, I'm not funded. I'm simply filling this need out of my own pocket. Now, donations are accepted below through the Patreon link. If corporate sponsors wish to chip in, it'd be greatly appreciated. But bear in mind, I will not directly endorse a product unless it helps the maker community. I'd recommend contacting us to arrange supporting specific projects, which will help you with a thank you in the video and maybe even a product placement, but only if the product is provided. The email link is in the video description below. How can I contact you? I have an idea. Okay. If you have an idea or suggestion to improve the channel, or think something needs a better explanation than what I gave, drop me a line at aharper, AHARPER, at aerospacemaker.org, and we'll work through it. If your suggestions substantially improve the videos, I'll send you something as a thank you. Now, this one was actually interesting. What's with the let's go thing at the end of the video? You know, most people do some sort of thing and have a clever phrase at the end of the video. One of my favorites is gentleman by the name of Samurai Carpenter. Samurai out. Um, his videos are awesome. Look him up if you're into any kind of woodworking. And there's others that do something similar. Another favorite of mine is Robert Murray Smith, who explains exactly how graphene works and how to produce it. And he says, things like, well, I hope that was of interest to you, and thank you for watching. And, polite Englishman as always. I use a very simple phrase of let's go because it was spoken to me. I had opportunity to meet the gentleman by the name of Homer Hickam, a NASA engineer, and if you've ever seen Red Rocket Boys or September Sky, I believe it was, the movie, he grew up in a little town called Coalwood, West Virginia, and he pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He was a group of several boys that went out and made things. They made rockets. They learned about it. They heard what Werner von Braun back in the late 50s was doing, and they wanted a piece of that action. They wanted to go and do things. And that's how he entered the aerospace arena, and he became a NASA engineer, et cetera, et cetera. Now, meeting him, I had a couple of ideas. One particular project had some issues which in retrospect were more societal and ethical more so than engineering. And after a fairly lengthy discussion, partially in person, partially via email, he simply said, let's go. In other words, quit worrying about it and just do it. He later autographed a book of his to me with the same words, let's go. So at the end of the video, rather than quibble about the minor details, which we will cover eventually, I use the phrase, let's go. Please like the video if you like the channel and subscribe so you don't miss a video. And visit our site, aerospacemaker.org. As time goes on, more and more information will be presented there. And to support this channel and accelerate improvements, please donate to us through the Patreon link below.